All right. Well, I'm excited to be back. We're talking about our book, When Crisis Strikes, 5 Steps to Heal Your Brain, Body, and Life from Chronic Stress. This is the third part, right? We did the first part was the why, we did the what was the second one, and now we're on to the how of the book, right? How the book can help you with your crisis. Jenny, maybe you would like to say something about this part of the book.
Yeah, so for those of you who are just joining us, I'm Dr. Jennifer Love, and I work at Amen Clinics, and this is Dr. Kjell Tore Hovik, my co-author for the book. And if you missed the first 2 webinars, you can go back and watch them as Dr. Hovik explained. We went through kind of who we are, why we collaborated on the book, how we came up with these 5 steps, and really what we want to get into is who can benefit from it. And, you know, so interesting when you're writing a book, you have to turn it in and then it gets published like a year later because there's all these editing steps. So we turned in our manuscript January 1st of 2020. And then all of a sudden, 2020 happened. And so it was really when we're talking about, well, who can use the steps? It's who can't? All of us, right? And we even talk about that in the book. The editors asked us to write our COVID diaries of kind of a brief, a couple pages of what happened to us this year and how we used each of the 5 steps. If you watched our last webinar, we talked about step 1, which is getting a grip. And the rest of the steps are top secret until the book comes out. Our publisher is just our mouths are duct tape closed. We're under contract. It's been so frustrating this year, right? Because I want to use all these steps with my patients, and I have to reword it so I'm not using the steps. But really, I think for me this year it was so helpful to have because we have all these tools in our toolboxes. I'm a psychiatrist, I have 3 board certifications, you're a clinical neuropsychologist, all these tools. But what we developed for the book was a rearranging of those tools into a way that's actually easy to access during crisis. And I had a lot this year. Did you?
I did, and it was almost I didn't, fortunately not a major crisis like many people are experiencing, but everybody being in this lockdown and the same. I'm in Norway, and we're having the same kind of difficulties and isolation issues and things like that as you are in the States. I felt that it was just good to have something to go to. It was I wanted to use the steps. It was like having a mental health tune-up, really. I could just go through the steps, work through them, get to know them better. And it was filling every day with something interesting to do and to work on. So I felt that it was really a very helpful thing for me to work through these steps in the order that they're put out. And just really kind of a challenging thing, and a thing that gave me a lot of growth just being able to work through them.
Right. And certainly I had, as we were writing the book, every crisis I'd ever had in mind, and talk about several of them in the book, even in the intro and the preface of the book. As we mentioned last time in the book, we apply the whole second half of the book is taking the 5 steps and applying them to a variety of very real world situations. And we put them in categories just to kind of make it easier to find things that may be more relevant for you as a reader. We have a section on chronic illness, and we have examples of people using the steps with depression, borderline personality disorder, terminal cancer, and chronic pain. There's a section on family crisis, and I think Dr. Hovik, your input on this section was just incredible with your background in neurodevelopment. Do you want to go through, list some of the cases that are in that section? Do you have that in front of you?
Right. I think there's this difference. Some of the cases are individually based, right? For individuals, I think usually working through the steps, you usually need to see it from an individual perspective. But just in the family crisis section, it's also, we're expanding it to be able to work family wide, right? So you have maybe two parents with a raging child with a developmental disorder that's just out of control. You might have something, involving maybe somebody, well, self-harm, or maybe there's even a, threats of taking their own life, or maybe they've even, the case of maybe somebody having taken their own lives in a family. And the whole family has to come together and work together, and they can then work through these steps in their healing process.
Right. I think the idea of this section is when an individual goes through crisis, oftentimes the whole family is in crisis by proxy. And so we have several examples of that. We have a family who has someone with an addiction living in the household. You wrote a really interesting case about parents of a child with special needs and how they use the steps, having a partner who has an illness, a parent with cognitive decline, very real world things. And we take like your background in development and working with Tourette's and ADHD and my background in addictions and working with all these families to really put all this together. We have a whole section on loss. And I think, 2020 has been a lot of loss. But we go through some practical things like divorce and, like you were mentioning, death of a loved one, a suicide. And
bad breakups where there's just a chaos of ramifications around it, not just, and maybe involving the entire family.
Yeah. And for me, this section was particularly difficult, having lost people in my life, and a friend of mine who lost her sister, and writing about these things was it was really hard to get in there and to go through the steps, because even the things that we personally haven't gone through, we've gone through with our patients. And but that section was a tough one. We have a whole section on trauma. And Dr. Hovik, you wrote a really interesting story about bullying and how the steps were used on this individual. We even talked about a mass shooting. And I know the US and Norway are very different on this, but Norway, it has much fewer. I think there have been 2 that came up in the news while we were writing this book. And then, of course, we get to existential crises. And Kjell Tore and I have talked many times for no reason at all about midlife crises and having midlife crisis. It's totally irrelevant to us. We're way too young for that, but we do get into that. And also spiritual crises and what happens like when you feel like your faith is challenged or you're losing a big part of yourself. So we really do try to demonstrate how the steps can be used in such a wide variety of situations by sharing people's stories with you. So it just reads like almost like a section of little biographies, which I love because I love reading biographies.
And there's this common thread that all of these that we take, they're very, very serious, major type of crises that are throwing people kind of off their game, right? It's just devastating. And then the question is, and still life is going on. So how do you deal with this? How do you get through life while your inside is just chaos because of the stress response that you described very, very well earlier in chapters, in an earlier chapter, Dr. Love. So there's that, okay, well, what do you do? How do you start, right? I mean, many people will get through it just fine. But there's, some people that really are reacting because of certain circumstances, maybe many factors, many stress factors. It's just overwhelming. And then the question is, well, where do I start? How do I start? How do I get going? I need to get through this. At the same time, I've got a family, I've got relationships, I've got work, I've got to stay inside and think of something to do because I can't go out to restaurants or I can't go out to see my friends. So what do? We can use these steps then start on the steps to help us get through that process.
Mm-hmm. And after we had finished the editing process and we were kind of at the end, our publishers came back and asked if we could write our own stories, which is pretty vulnerable. But you and I both have had so many things happen to us in 2020 alone. And I thought it might be interesting to kind of share that with people, to read through just those stories and maybe the first step, since we already talked about the first step and how to get a grip and a little bit of what we went through this year. Do you want to read yours?
Okay.
I know it's like our first official reading. Maybe I should read yours and you should read mine. I don't know. You read yours slowly, and then how about we run out of time?
No. Okay. My COVID crisis. The drastic measures of closing schools, stopping travel, and minimizing contact with the elderly were imposed in Norway in early March 2020. It was still the middle of winter here in Norway, with ice on the lakes, snow in the mountains, and the town full of ski tourists. At the time, I was working at 2 separate psychiatric wards in a hospital about an hour away from my home in Lillehammer. One of the wards treats young people with early symptoms of psychosis, which is a very serious thought disorder and can lead to schizophrenia. And the other treats older people with early signs of dementia. Even though direct patient contact was reduced to urgent care, I continued to drive to work on a daily basis throughout the period to help as needed. The morning drive along Lake Mjøsa was toward the sun rising in the east, and the drive home in the evening was toward the sun setting in the west, down between the mountains, often with spectacular displays of light across the lake in both directions. The entire stretch of road was being upgraded from 1 to 2 lanes, however, so frequent detours and stops gave me a chance to get plenty of practice doing the breathing techniques I use for stressful situations at the hospital. My mother, who was 79 years old, was stuck in her home in California when the shelter-in-place order was issued. She could not travel to Norway, and I could not travel to the United States. I was worried about her. Very worried, but my daughter was studying at a university close to her house in California, so I knew she was not alone if she needed help. Here in Lillehammer, we were allowed to go for walks and ski on the mountains, but it had to be alone. We were not permitted to see friends, go to the gym, or visit restaurants. From day 1 of the COVID crisis, I applied the 5 steps to my life and my daily schedule. It worked out well because Jennifer and I were reading through the edits for this book at the same time. It gave me a chance to really think about the steps and how to use them practically in a life-changing crisis lasting over a period of months, as it turns out, even longer. So I'll just take the step 1, get a grip. Having traveled on transatlantic flights since I was 2 years old, my first impulse when our Prime Minister announced the emergency on TV was to look up, expecting oxygen masks to drop down from an overhead compartment. Nothing popped out. I wouldn't say it was a letdown, but I think that kid in me was hoping that I would finally get to try on those yellow masks and orange vests with bright red whistles dangling that were reserved for the crew on normal flights and passengers only in emergencies. I remember the stewardesses always saying, "In case of emergency, stay calm and make sure you put the yellow mask on yourself first so you can breathe properly, then help others who might need help." Right. So in reality, I had been training for this crisis since I was about 2 years old. To externalize the drama of the moment and to help me gain a grip of the situation, I identified the main problem I was facing. It was a lack of control. Control has always been an issue in my life. My father let me down in my childhood when my parents divorced, and he started one company after another without time for me. So I developed a hard shell that refused to trust anyone other than myself. The emotional response became a need to control situations in a way that would protect me from broken expectations. My good fortune was that I had many loving and dependable adults in my life, mom, uncles, and aunts, who always exceeded my expectation, so I have nothing to complain about. Yet there was something very powerful about those early negative experiences with my father that I have never quite been able to shake. The flip side of control is trust. To me, if you hand over your control to someone else, that is a sign that you trust that person. And my time here in Norway had given me such a good experience with the system of government that I confidently put my trust in the authorities to make the right decisions for the country and my family during this crisis. This confidence in the system made it easier for me to relax about handing over any freedom of movement and let me focus on getting on with the business of making the most out of a difficult situation and continuing working on the other steps.
That I love. And by the way, raise your hand if you can hear the weed whacker. That's literally right outside my windows. We're recording. I'm trying to mute, but gardeners come. That's not my gardener. But what I loved is the vulnerability in that your quirky Norwegian humor, but it's that honesty of control. And what was really hard was that loss of control, not only of like your everyday life and where you go and who you're with, but like not being able to go see your mom and how terrifying that is. And so there's a lot in there, and I just appreciate that. I can read my COVID crisis.
Yeah.
Weed whacker doesn't get too loud. And if it is, just put your hand up, we can mute and come back to it. So this was my COVID crisis. Waking up to a global pandemic just weeks after turning in a manuscript for a book on solving life crisis was surreal. I wanted to jump online, start giving seminars, get the steps out there, but that just isn't possible in the publishing world. I was left having to be an expert on mental health with many of my tools, like these 5 steps, temporarily removed from my public toolbox. The initial weeks were challenging, moving my practice home, transitioning to an entirely telemedicine practice. What a nightmare. With limited IT support, an assistant far away, having to figure out prescriptions, the handling of handwritten therapy notes. Basically, my day-to-day practice of medicine had to be reinvented overnight without skipping a beat. It was a rough start. As fate would have it, I was stuck alone during shelter in place. I had to figure out life without the in-person support I've always known. As I prepared my taxes, I learned someone had stolen my identity and filed taxes in my name, stealing my return. I still don't have that, by the way. Still waiting. As the crisis was growing, many of my patients were struggling, so my hours of patient care increased, and I was left trying to cram in calls to the IRS, which was closed, by the way. It was all voicemail. And to anyone who could tell me what to do about my tax situation. Of course, I also had the same issues we all had: the eeriness of getting groceries and a face mask, the lack of toilet paper, the online hysteria, the conspiracy theories that help no one and serve no purpose other than fostering anger and mistrust. We all experience the same situation, but differently. Some of us were in high impact areas, some were not. Some of us lost jobs, some did not. Some suffered alone, others suffered at the hands of those in their shared home. Some kept their health, some did not. We each have a story to tell. As I'm writing this, I'm still in isolation, still having to be flexible about the future. I'm still in it, so my steps are ongoing, and I change them as I go, as new needs and challenges emerge. I'm still a work in progress, but that's the point, isn't it? These life crises we face, cancer, loss, abuse, depression, are never magically solved one day by some declaration. We work through them, beyond them, and sometimes can't see around the corner where life's path is taking us. Here's how I'm using the 5 steps right now. Step 1, get a grip. Okay, you know the basics. Cut off from in-person contact with family and friends, increased work hours, which is a blessing given how many people are out of work, but emotionally quite challenging, given the patients I've known for years are suffering and in need of more intensive care. Lots of after-hours emergency calls, loss of exercise routine, hugs, weekly brunches and walks with friends, the hours it takes for a simple grocery run, the anxiety of the unknown. Throw in my identity being stolen along with my tax return, being separated from my mother who has significant health issues. And I think the surface of the problem is easily identified. But what does this mean to me? I'm a happy introvert and find freedom in being alone. Not all the time, but I probably enjoy it more than the average person. But in my worst moments, the isolation struck a deep root. My shift in perception was a surprise to me. I was going through old travel photos and ran across a favorite, an old tunnel in a small ancient village in Tuscany. I have loved this photo all the years since I took it. I remember the feeling I had in the tunnel, wanting to stop and touch all the stones that were hundreds of years old, and at the same time wanting to run like a child to the end to see where it would lead me. This time, however, I was shocked to encounter a sense of darkness in the photo. Instead of feeling excited curiosity, I felt the tunnel leading towards some kind of impending doom. It hit me hard. Was my outlook changing? I started having some really difficult days, feeling a vague sense of loss, loneliness. Part of this was obvious. Let's face it, a pandemic is a dark time, and I have many friends on the front lines putting their health and lives at risk to treat their patients. But part of this came from somewhere deeper. When I was very young, my dad left the family. As an adult and psychiatrist, I know this abandonment was his flaw, not mine. He was the one who should have been genetically programmed to take care of me and to support me, and he didn't. But children don't understand this and internalize these things. And over the years, loss has sometimes brought on the belief I will always be alone because no one wants me. No one will ever take care of me. I will always have to take care of myself alone. It's a vulnerable admission to publish in a book, trust me, and to read on a webinar, by the way. But I know I'm not the only one with these moments, feeling unworthy of love despite knowing I'm worthy of love. It's my own battle of emotion versus logic. And to move forward from my sadness, I had to once again recognize and acknowledge its origins, as distant as they felt. So yeah, we both mentioned these very kind of deep experiences that contributed to the challenges we had in adjusting to COVID this year.
It's beautiful story, and it's that vulnerability, and that's part of who we are, and it's part of how we deal with difficulties. It's how we deal with crises, and it's part of that kind of idea of working through the steps to find out what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, what we can bring to the situation to help us resolve it, to make it better, to heal, what we kind of need to cultivate of maybe even personality characteristics or traits, or intellectual characteristics and traits. Things like being extrovert, to reach out, social, things like being creative, things like being maybe flexible or inclusive. All these issues are part of what we try to bring out in the book to understand yourself, so that you can use that to help that in that healing process. So it's
Right.
part of that.
And it's definitely, we talked a lot about practicing the skills, and we practice the steps this year, but we really do practice for crisis. I grew up in California, so I grew up with earthquake drills. Our parents' generation, I think, had nuclear bombing drills. Kids today have mass shooting drills, at least in the US. And there's this sense, I tell my patients when I'm treating panic disorder that there are certain breathing techniques that can really help pull you out of panic. But if you wait until you're panicked to implement them, it's going to feel too unnatural and be too challenging. You have to practice that ahead of time and get comfortable with it. So if you wake up during the night and you're having a panic attack, you automatically know what to do. That was the point of all these drills. And I think you talk about that a bit too with athletes.
Exactly. I give some examples on that, right? Like, for example, if you're thinking if you're a golfer and you're in a tournament and you're on the 17th hole, for example, on the last day, and you hit the ball in the water, right? What's going through your mind then? if the professionals and the people that are in those situations, if they're competing, they've been training for that, to what to do and how to kind of regroup, get their thoughts on something positive, get those negative thoughts out. For example, if you're a ski jumper and you're just ahead of the last jump and somebody gives you a little hint that maybe, reminds you about an earlier crash, how do you then, suddenly your head is filled with just terror because you just crashed, you're thinking about those thoughts. Well, if you have the practice of the mental routines, you can then get those thoughts away, tone them down, and bring in the positive thoughts, and then help yourself to get on and get through it with the positivity that you need. But it does take some practice, and that's what we also kind of introduce and offer in the book, is that idea of working on that, practicing it, and trying to make it automatic.
Right. I gave the example, we were on a podcast a few weeks ago about my divorce and how horrible my divorce was. And it was a trigger of a very early childhood trauma. And I emotionally felt like a child. I had a hard time articulating my feelings and words. Like, I just kind of shut down like kids do in that situation. And having had so much practice, in the decades since, it's really about, when you have these tools, you know them, you use them, it's much easier then to utilize them without getting trapped in an emotional state. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us for the webinar. I hope you got kind of an understanding of who we are and all of our goofiness and vulnerabilities, and a little peek into how we came up with the 5-step process, who it can be useful for. And now it's time to go out and order the book, people.
Yeah, with the book and with your hand, right, and the 5 steps, you've got a program to heal whatever challenge that you're facing, and even if there's not a major crisis, like I did during COVID, just using the steps as almost like a mental health tune-up has been just really rewarding for me. I thought that's really been an interesting way of spending the time being isolated as well, and having something really interesting and challenging to work on.
Okay, well, interesting for you as a clinical neuropsychologist,
yeah.
Probably less interesting to the rest of us who are actually going through crisis. But this is why we have co-authors, and I love it, this balance of, we each have these very nerdy sides, and then we each have these goofy sides, and we just have to figure out how to balance that. Thank you all for joining us. Books available on Amazon and online at the Amen Clinic. I hope you'll buy copies for yourself, for your loved ones, for your family members. And we look forward to hearing from you on your thoughts on the book and what you think about it. Have a great day, everyone.